this presentation. We have Professor Frank here also ready to go. And I want to welcome you to the sounding board. Can everybody hear me well? Can you just say, yeah, thank you very much. My name is Nellie Iredale. I'm the sounding board chair. This is Oceanids' 36th year, which is an official support group of the university. The sounding board is a joint effort of the faculty club and Oceanids. Our honorary chair is Despin Kavulakis, Associate of the Chancellor, and our president is Nigella Hilgard. In Oceanids, we raise money for grants and awards for students, support other UCSD events as activities such as the student-run free clinic. We offer many events for our members, and sounding board is one of these events. We would like to have you as a member, and I encourage you to join. It's only $35 per year. We are happy to see you now via Zoom. This event is the first Thursday of the month throughout the academic year, except for January. Now, I would like to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Frank. We're honored to have you here. He is the Associate Professor of the Department of Ethnic Studies, UCSD. The subject will be Picturing History, Plains Indian Ledger Drawings and Worldview. And a little about Professor Frank. He received his BA in History from Yale College and a second BA in History where he was awarded first class honors at Merton College, Oxford, and a Rhodes Scholarship. I would like to ask everybody to mute yourself, please, and thank you very much. He then entered the History Ph.D. program at the University of California, Berkeley, receiving his doctorate in 1992. Between a diverse number of appointments, he was in the American University in Washington, D.C., and the National Museum of American History. At the Smithsonian, he worked as a consulting historian for the American Encounters exhibition. He began his appointment at the University of California, San Diego in 1992 as an assistant professor of ethnic studies. Welcome, Professor Frank. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to talk to Oceanids. This group was actually the first group that supported the project that this research and this talk comes from back in the early 90s or mid 90s. It's kind of coming around again. And I also want to thank Nellie for organizing and having good communication with me. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Kumeyaay people as the traditional caretakers of the land that UCSD is built on and the surrounding ecoscape. And that includes where I'm zooming from, which is southern Carlsbad as well. We work at UCSD mindful of the indigenous peoples in this place, past, present, and emerging, and also our responsibility for both thinking about caretaking of the land, but also providing education to the current populations that are from descendants from these peoples. So let's see. I'm going to share my screen. This is a fairly small group. So there will be some conversation here, and I'm probably going to ask you all to pitch in to talk about what you see and answer perhaps some questions that I have. Probably the best way of doing that is to raise your hand in the participants window if you have that open. There's a little hand that you can raise on you, or you can answer by typing something in the chat window that you. But in any case, if you're going to say something, remember to unmute yourself so that we can hear you, and then mute yourself afterwards so that background noise doesn't get in. Okay, so this is the presentation, Picturing History, Plains Indian Ledger Drawings and Worldview. And I'm going to start, I'm going to go through kind of introducing you to what these ledger drawings, these drawings on paper by Plains Indians in the 1860s through 1890s look like, and kind of how they work and what favorite images I have that I like. um, and then we're going to talk about storytelling and meaning. So what do these images actually, what are they about? And how do we understand them? And what are the problems of understanding them? And then we'll talk about some specific themes that appear in Plains ledger art with picturing genres, um, and also the way in which the drawings say things about historical events and changes in over the period of time where these things were being created in this 1860s through 1890s. And finally, a way of understanding what they say about the worldview of Plains Indians, although we're building up to that throughout the entire presentation. Um, so I'm just going to start with a little, some of you may have seen this exhibition. It was at the Mingay Museum shortly before it closed for renovations. It was called Voluminous Art, Treasures from San Diego's University Libraries. And one of the images, one of the volumes that was in that exhibit was one of these Plains Indian ledger books. This one, and I'll talk about why we call them ledger books in the first place. But this one is actually in a commercial sketchbook, right? The pages of a commercial sketchbook. And it's called as it says in the bottom there, the Koba or Kobe is how you pronounce it, Russell sketchbook. I start here because this happens to be a book of Indian drawings, of Plains Indian drawings. These are Kiowa. Um, and these are Kiowa, and this particular volume is at UCSD. It's in the Mandeville Special Collections. It's part of the Plains Indian Ledger Art collection. And even though my project started as a digital project, it's actually attracted significant resources and ended up acquiring a pretty spectacular collection of the actual ledger books. So I'm going to start here. We already have a question from Rosemary about how does picturing history differ with other tribes? Um, the Plains tribes that we're talking about today, mostly Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa, and this tradition extends a little bit further to Crow, Blackfeet, Assiniboine, but it's really the Plains peoples. It's somewhat unique. There are visual traditions in every native tribe in North America and elsewhere, of course, as well. But this is a very specific historical moment, which I'm going to talk about in a second. This particular book actually says a lot about what that moment is. This book was done by Koba, a Kiowa warrior, as a prisoner at Fort Marion, in the old St. Augustine fortress in Florida. And the Koba, with a group of 72 Indians, were held there from 1875 through 1878 as punishment for participating in what is now called the Red River War, ended in 1872. And it basically, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of the military, but it was a Southern Plains uprising against settler invasion. It ended with the breaking of the military power of the Southern Plains, Kiowa, and Cheyenne peoples, who were placed on the reservations. That process had already begun, but it was permanent after 1872. And as a price for the end of hostilities, the tribes had to cough up sort of ringleaders, and these were generally young warriors who were actually selected to go into prison at Fort Marion. They were under Captain Richard H. Pratt, who believed in civilizing the Indians and removing them from their their non-white settler normative uh, identities, but he allowed them to draw and draw pictures of their own lives and past lives, and that's what this book is part of. This is the original cover of the sketchbook, and here you actually can see that this is given to Miss Josephine Russell, who was a teacher at Fort Marion, a volunteer teacher, and Captain Pratt actually gave it to her in 1876. It was drawn by Koba, whose translated name is Wild Horse, a Kiowa Indian, while prisoner at San Augustine, Florida. And there's some just incredibly amazing drawings here of Kiowa herding horses. And notice that it's not just male folks rounding up the horses, but a woman who's actually dressed as a warrior with a war shield and a lance. Interesting. The captions are Pratt's captions, and that's already tells us something about how kind of some of the dangers about interpreting these things. Everyone would love to use the captions as a hook to interpret what's going on here. But as you can see from the letters which accompanied this book, Captain Pratt actually, many years later, was sent this sketchbook and then wrote the captions that we have now in it. So he was at a remove from when these actually were drawn, and it's his interpretation of what the Kiowa or Cheyenne warriors wanted to actually, were actually drawing about. So that even though these pictures end up in non-Indian hands, and they were generally drawn in order to either sell to visitors or through Captain Pratt to be given to important personages that came to visit Fort Marion, because Pratt was always interested in building up the reputation of what he was trying to do there. The meanings of what's actually in this book. So this is Pratt saying that he was going to he had returned the book with the captions and given them an illustrated booklet about the Carlisle Indian School, which he had started by that time. Carlisle Indian School, by the way, is the first boarding school, and it starts all the Indian boarding schools from late 1870s to 1930s. It's the model, and that was tested out in this prison in Fort Marion during the 1875-1878 period. And so here's a classroom of what it might have looked like in Fort Marion when Josephine Russell was a volunteer teacher. This is a special presentation where Captain Pratt is with Colonel Hamilton and the interpreter who did much of the interpretation at the prison, and Colonel Hamilton is giving an address to the young men who are sitting here listening. So you get an idea of kind of what some of the life was like in Fort Marion. Now, a lot of people, if they know about Plains ledger art at all, know about this Fort Marion period. It is, in some sense, an anomaly. It became known more earliest of the ledger drawings, but it actually is only this specific 3 years when the 72 prisoners were placed in Fort Marion and were encouraged by Pratt to draw. and it became a kind of side way of making some money as well. 20 some of the 72 were actually artists. And so this became known as the way in which Plains people drew. And it was actually assumed at first that this drawing style began at Fort Marion, but in fact, it precedes that by a good 10 to 20 years. Here's an example of a Cheyenne drawing by a man named Arrow. We only know his name because of the glyph that's here in the upper right-hand corner of the arrow. That is his name glyph. And he is the protagonist, one of these men here, probably this one, who's well-dressed. And they are lassoing a horse. And what I love about this is the kind of movement you get, this feeling of incredible kind of powerful movement. And then the actual action where this gentleman, this is trying to lasso this magnificent yellow animal with a marking, a cavalry marking. So this is a captured animal of some sort. And he's missing, his lasso is falling short of getting over the neck. So this person is stepping in, maybe making another attempt. But I love the feeling of movement here, as well as the really clever drawing style. Here's another Cheyenne, more whimsical in a sense. This is a courting scene. And it's showing this man who's designated by a tree or a lone tree or something like that. We don't know exactly who he is. And it shows his path. And it's essentially a kind of serial dating system where he's meeting 4 different women over the period of this day or evening or afternoon. And they're lined up there. Probably weren't lined up at the time, but it's showing this kind of picture of the way courting proceeded on the reservation in late 1870s, early 1880s, in the Cheyenne, Southern Cheyenne Reservation, which is in what was then Indian Territory. It's now Oklahoma. And here's another one. This is related. In fact, this is done by the same artist as did the lassoing of the horses I showed you a minute ago. But this is a warrior society called the Kit Fox Society. And you can see at the top here, the first man in red is holding the stuffed Kit Fox. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but I love the procession. Everyone is somewhat the same, but then everyone is individualized with the name glyph above, and someone has actually numbered these folks. And if you look at this is 2 pages where both sides of pages are drawn. And the procession proceeds from here, the leading man with the Kit Fox, and it goes around this way, around the bottom and to the left, up to the top. So it's kind of flipped. They've used the page as if it were a double page end to end, but they've flipped it. And this is something that we'll talk about in terms of the way these things are put together in a minute. I love the aesthetics of the similarly dressed but differentiated members of this warrior society, which was a significant society in the Cheyenne world. Let's think about then how these tell stories. And I'm going to start with kind of asking some questions of you all. So get ready. The first is not a Plains Ledger piece. This is a drawing by Albrecht Dürer, and it nicely gives you his symbol and the date that it was drawn in a while back. And I think we're struck at first by this, the amazing draftsmanship of this piece, the sense of corporality, the weight of this small bird, the presence, incredible detail, the feathers, the sort of modeling of the different sepia, and the underdrawing, which is this graphite area here, and how that changes the coloring of the face. It's extraordinarily done. And also how it's set in the scene with sort of the suggestion of a three-dimensionality, a three-dimensional space, almost a draftsman tile-like space, but a little bit of foreground as well. And, you know, I'm wondering, do we worry here about it? I mean, does this seem familiar? Is it something you can understand and recognize by just looking at it? That's the first question. And I see some people nodding your head. But there's nothing here that we feel challenged in understanding. And the way in which it's drawn makes us think that there's no real narrative here. It's an owl. It's an extraordinarily well done in sort of tour de force of an owl. But there's no narrative that we need to sort of look for, delve for. And it doesn't, and we don't really feel the need to sort of scratch the surface for a deeper meaning. Now, maybe among you, some historian might say, well, owls had a particular understanding in the literature in Renaissance Northern Europe, or it was owls were connected in particular ways in biblical texts, or there might be some way in which owls for you have some, but you don't feel challenged that you have to come up with some extra narrative in order to understand this piece. However, when I show you this one, which is a ledger drawing from Lakota Cheyenne River, which is northern Dakotas. This is done in 1880, 1881. It's a female bat, and in fact, she's lactating and has suckling baby bats. But this thing just feels different, doesn't it? And it was drawn about 120 years ago. The Dürer was drawn in 1508, so quite a bit longer ago. And which one feels to you the most different? That was a question. You can all answer it. But do you agree with me that this one feels more different to our sensibilities than the Dürer, right? You wonder whether there's a hidden meaning here. Why a bat's being drawn? Why this bat seems to be so imposing and maybe even scary, right? Well, bats may be scary anyway. They're near Halloween. But my point is that there's something about the way in which this appears that that although it's recognizable as a picture, image art, there's something that kind of begs interpretation. And let me just throw you another curveball and show you a picture of the hollow bulls in the Lascaux caves in France. And this is, 13 to 15,000 years before the current era. And we know that there's supposed to be some sort of narrative here. We always makes you wonder the sense of difference between when folks did this on the walls of the cave in Lascaux and today is palpable. But all we can really do is have a kind of more general or speculative response as to why these are on the wall, although there's voluminous amounts of scholarship on this, and that's generally how those pieces work as well. And we're all too aware of the loss of possible knowledge about how to contextualize these pieces between us and folks who were living 13 to 15,000 years ago. We can't assume any particular commonality that will give us a way of understanding what was happening, let alone the cultural difference that we can impute between then and now. So this brings me back to Albrecht Dürer and a print of an engraving that he did in, says 1518, of the Virgin and Child crowned by two angels. And my point here is a more general one. So when we look at these things, we have a set of widely shared cultural ideas about what art is and values about what art portrays that allow us to understand the context the minute we look at it. We understand that there's a narrative here, that this is about Mary and the virgin birth, that this is about the crucifixion of the Christ child foretold. And it's even made more evident by the fact that Mary, even though she's still suckling the Christ child, is already being crowned as the mother of Christ in heaven. So it's foretelling the whole history of the Christ's troubles, tribulations, crucifixion, and resurrection in this one thing. And we have the cultural understanding and knowledge, if we've grown up in kind of the Western world, to have some inkling about how this story is part of a larger context. As opposed to the procession that I showed you earlier, where we see that the dress, the markings, and the activity communicates the idea of a ceremonial procession. The Cheyenne who see this would know the cultural context. They would know that this is a kit fox society and that they can see the kit fox right there. They can see that the emblems of membership in the society are being held in one way or another by every person here, either the sashes or the fans. They can see they know about the story of the culture hero Sweet Medicine, who created the Kit Fox Society back in the past as one of the 3 or 4 original warrior societies that was given to the Cheyenne people. And they understand what the mark on the mouth is. It's the mark of manpower. It's also kind of similar to a buffalo's hoof. And these lifelines that are painted, they're actually painted with they're kind of with the tip of the lance that's also part of the warrior. But these are cultural things that Cheyenne would know and we wouldn't know, right? The point here is that we recognize just by looking at ledger drawings like this one, that they hold information about a Cheyenne worldview that underlies this and other things that we just don't have the purchase on. And because of the way historically that Plains Indian religion and peoples were suppressed as a culture in the beginning of the 19th century, it means that for most of us, we're looking at this is as if we were looking at, oh, so here's another kind of ceremonial system. So we know that there's something behind this. We just don't have the access to what it is. So for most of us, looking at this material is like looking at the drawing of Durer's Last Judgment without knowing anything about the Bible or Catholic doctrine. So that's where we are in trying to figure out what these things have to say to us. Obviously, their sources for doing this come from existing descending communities, from anthropologists and ethnohistorians of the present and the past, but also of kind of retooling the way we look at these things to think about what they're actually showing. So we're going to start doing this with the picture of the Ewer's ledger. And this is one of those kind of older types of drawing that precedes the Fort Marion pieces that I showed you early on that Koba had done that were in that book. And you can see it's on a page of an account from an accountant's ledger book. In fact, this book still is whole and has a number of drawings in it. So this is one of the pages. This is page 25, and you can see the line and the columns for, doing sums, figures, and lists. And many of these, and the reason why it's called ledger art is because many of the earliest books that were most that were incorporated into the Cheyenne way of life when they were doing battle with the U.S. military in the 1870s and 1860s, actually were drawn on military accountants' ledger books that were either given in annuities or taken in raids or purchased through trade, and then drawn on as a way of portably taking these images with them as they move from place to place across the plains. Prior to this, there was a pictorial drawing tradition on deer and buffalo hides, so hide paintings, and they were also pictorial. But the way in which these pictures were made changed when they became more compact and had to be accommodated to an 8x11 or an 8.5 by 14 inch space, like you see here, or a double page, as we'll see in a minute. So just looking at this, do you have any ideas about what's going on here? What's the story? Hands up, or unmute yourself and blurt it out, or type it in the chat. What's going on here? How would you describe this?
This is Vicky. It looks like the Indian is chasing the soldier.
Right.
And the Indian has a rifle. Yep,
the Indian has a rifle pointed directly at this cavalry person with the cavalry sword. Yeah. Okay, and how do you interpret any of the other parts of this? What's happening around?
Well, there's a lot of arrows.
Right, so these looks like arrows, right?
Yes, and around the border it looks like guns all the way around.
There you go. So it's showing a really tautly wrought exploit where the protagonist, who's almost always in these drawings on the right, and not every single time, but almost always. So he's the sort of protagonist. He's chasing down this cavalry person, and you can see the shield and all there are all these specific details that show that he's Cheyenne, he's a warrior, and then these are rifles, and these are the powder shots coming out of the rifle. And these are not arrows, but they're bullets, and they're actually showing the life of the bullet, right? So the ball and then the energy that's propelling the ball. So it's actually making visible something that's normally not visible in terms of energy. And that's already telling you something about what these drawings are about. That way of making visible certain forms of energy is actually crucial to understanding what's happening here. But you can see that, because of the media, because of the kind of accommodations that Plains people made to put these exploits on paper, and this is a war exploit, there are commonalities that allow us to have some sort of beginning understanding just by looking and puzzling at what's being shown to us. And of course, there are details like the cutlass, the cavalry cutlass, the striped pants, the material, the old army saddle, the cinch. things like that, as well as things we know about like shields, plain shields, and the tied pony, war pony tail, that, you know, allow us to say something about what's happening here. So I'm going to take that one understanding that we went through and just show you a little bit about how these things are put together. And I'm starting with a more complicated ledger drawing, which is also from the earlier period, showing a military exploit. And one of the things to understand about these, at least the ones that are showing military battles, as this is about men, warriors getting status within Cheyenne or Kiowa or Lakota society. So it's a way of documenting the exploits a particular person does as a warrior, that redounds on his prowess and power. And through his association with a band, a group of warriors, and the tribal group itself, he is bringing status and acknowledgement to that group. So it's an individual status, it's a group like the war party status, and then through success in battle, it also brings recognition and a certain kind of status to the larger group. And so very much these are interested in that issue. So we have here a 2-page system, and unlike the procession, which went from upper right-hand side down and up and across to the left and then up to the left, this one goes the other way around. If you look at the single page, just the page where things are happening, you can see it's very similar to the Cheyenne one that we looked at before, the Ewer's ledger, with the protagonist, the Cheyenne person on the right here, and the enemy, who's actually a Crow warrior. We'll talk about why we know that, on the left. Here, there's a mixture of the bullets you see flying around. You don't see them like ringed by soldiers firing, but it's still, it's a fraught process. And you can see the footprints of the horse as it enters the frame. And what it's showing is the moment of the collision between the two, right? And we know it's a Cheyenne warrior by the things that he's wearing, the Crow enemy, the bullets that we recognized from the other image that we saw there. And these are arrows, so there's both bullets and arrows flying in this meeting, and the hoof tracks that show where this protagonist's horse has come from. And then there's specific details that show us why we know what we know. So we have the name glyph here, and you see it's almost like a little cartoon bubble, but it's saying that this man's name is Big Nose or Roman Nose. This is a typical design for a Cheyenne shield, known as a 4 directions design with the cross in blue. And we have the crooked bow lance. It says this is a important member of a important military warrior society, like the Kit Fox, but it's a different one, this crooked bow lance. We know this is a crow from that pompadour. It's a hairstyle that was where they had the top of their hair stand up. That was particularly Crow, along with long hair or even false hair. And then he's wearing this, he has a identifiable model of a rifle. So things are so detailed that you can actually tell which kind of rifle that he got from being a scout in the military. And you can tell he was a scout also because he's wearing a scout's capote. And then the way this is two-page narrative is drawn, this starts from the bottom here where the horse tracks not only enter up here where we were looking at before, but it shows how they've come all the way up the page into the next page, going in this direction. So it comes from the bottom right up the top, across the top to the left, and then down to the bottom. So this is how the narrative goes, and also how it was drawn. So here's our flow. And if you were to think about this in sort of non-Indian terms, we know from the way we read books, but also the way cartoons are drawn, this is how the narrative would look in a non-Cheyenne way, right? Where it would start here and be read with this happening first, and then moving off to here. If you were thinking about a book or a comic strip, as opposed to the way it looks on the page in the ledger book. By the way, this is another book that UCSD's PILA collection, the Plains Indian Ledger Art Collection, actually owns. It's in Geisel Library in the Mandeville Special Collections. The horse hoof tracks, as we've seen already, show the movement of this warrior. And this is not only how he gets to the scene, but it also says something about what's different moments of time, because this is an exploit that happens before we get to the final page here, right? He has come up with this other Crow warrior who is now on foot, and he has dispatched him with his bow lance, which he's still carrying. So you can see it wasn't like he threw it at him. It's just showing that this warrior was vanquished as he was trying to fit his arrow to his bow to shoot back on the way to this conflict over here. Meanwhile, these folks are shooting all the time, which is why the arrows and the bullets are flying around the battle. So this is an earlier period. These guys are firing continuously. And if you think about the way this is drawn, he started to draw from the top, and then he turned the whole thing over this way, and then finally he drew the rest of the scene over on what is the left hand page of the double page when it's rotated. So to summarize what's happening here, we have a method of rendering a very complex narrative, which retains the movement in time of the narrative from the very beginning, before the protagonist enters the scene, to things that he does during the process, like dispatching the man with the bow and arrow, the Crow person warrior here, under current constant fire, right? So there's this continuing time element in it, to the final moment where the two clash, that ends in the current moment. So it's showing the past, a continuing present, and then the present moment where they clash. And what's so interesting about the moment of the fight is how what's being depicted here is really not about who wins and who loses. It's about the power underlying the warrior's activities that will determine who wins and who loses. Right. So this is a moment of power that portends the end of this second Crow person. We don't see it here, but the very movement of the horses, the way they're juxtaposed within this narrative, portends the successful exploit where this person, Roman nose, is going to vanquish this crow warrior at the end of this moment in time. So it's actually showing a future moment as well, where the results of this power conflict will result. Okay, so now I want to move to looking at the different kinds of things that ledger art are doing, and to show how there's an equivalence in the way that they talk about individual and communal power. Again, this all comes from that understanding of men having to show themselves within Lakota or Kiowa or Cheyenne society as having power, and through their activities actually gaining power. This is power that women already have in Plains societies. Women can give birth. Women produce things in the village. They own the lodge. They work on producing and procuring food. Men have to actually go out and show that they can manipulate power in the world to their ends. And this is a way of documenting that. So the first ways are the ways in which we've already talked about, the military exploit, which particularly when ledger art starts becoming reduced, becoming created in the 1860s, is all connected to the warfare that's now exacerbated because of white movement west across the plains into hunting territories, the kinds of negotiations that are going on over trying to part Plains Indian groups from their land, and the warfare that resulted from that, beginning in the 1760s, actually puts more emphasis on military exploits than Plains society was used to. So in some sense, we're seeing a flowering and elaboration of the paths that men have to achieve personal, social, and communal status through military exploits. So it lends itself to the discovery and use of this new medium on these account and ledger books. And you have here, this is Eaglehead, who is dispatching a shot. It looks like it's a Pawnee warrior here, and another one who's somehow ramrodding the powder in his breech-loaded gun behind his back, which is a pretty interesting exploit as well. So we've seen this kind of warrior art, but also that there are these exploits that are about a whole band, in this case, attacking a Crow village, and this is a single teepee. And you can see the individual exploits of the counting coup, that is hitting the enemy with the non-lethal end of a weapon to show that you can get very, very close and still withstand the power of the enemy. So that just shows how powerful you are. So we have the military exploits, but we also have other kinds of exploits that are not about raiding or killing, vanquishing the enemy warrior. These are raids of enemy territory to take horses, very valuable commodities. And here we have the protagonist and a buddy on a horse that are have separated 4 horses from the Crow Indian herd, and they're escaping with their booty and being closely followed by Crow warriors who are shooting at them. And it looks like this gentleman has lost his horse, and that's why he's riding the protagonist's horse. This is Scares the Enemy, who is a Brule Lakota. This was done in the early 1880s. So this is done on the reservation, and it's done in a little teeny album that was generally used as it's like a album for what's it called? Um, Autographs. It's an autograph album. So it's not on the accountant's ledger books. It's on something that could have been purchased at a local supply or store. You notice the 4 hoofs showing one for each horse. He got a little carried away, and one of the horses seems to have 5 legs, but that's still what that's about. And here are the bullets that we're used to. And here is another from the same little sketchbook, our little autograph album, showing Scares the Enemy. And here is his name glyph. And his name glyph literally is, this guy is a enemy warrior who is from a warrior society where he was supposed to peg himself when in battle and not leave the scene unless he was either victorious or relieved by one of his fellow warriors. But Scares the Enemy's name glyph means that he's so scary, he's so powerful that he in fact gets the guy who's staked to leave his post. So he can't withstand the power. And here he is stealing 3 horses, again being followed by enemy people on horses with guns firing the bullets. So there's raiding, which is an exploit just like the fighting exploits, right? So there's an equivalence of different kinds of exploits that can give you status. And this is status that's partially about wealth, it's partially about contending with the enemy and coming up with more significant power. There's also ledger art about hunting, and this is often interspersed with military exploits in some of the earlier ledger books. This is another page from the Arrow Elk Society ledger. Arrow was a member of this warrior society, the Elk Society, and it's showing him hunting pronghorn antelope. And there's an analogy. The hunting is a metonym, kind of a metaphor for the same kind of power that you need to vanquish your enemy. The hunted animal is, in this sense, your enemy. You need to take it for food, and having the control over power enough to take that enemy hunted animal is a similar kind of exploit as to a military exploit or raiding for horses. There's also a metaphoric, metonymic relationship between courting in Plains society. So here's a Cheyenne courtship scene, and you wrap the woman of your affections in a blanket when she assents as part of the courtship process. Often there's actually a chaperone shown in ledger arts and ledger drawings as well. But the power that one attains that allows you to also successfully court women is another metaphoric path to gain status. So that picture that I showed you before about the serial dating really is about how powerful the love power of that other gentleman was. Here's a Lakota version of the same thing. The protagonist on the horse taking off his cloak and meeting the woman in a courtship scene. There's also ceremony, which is a way in which men can achieve power and status. Women are always involved in these ceremonies, but the power that they have is derived from their very person, the way in which they are the reproductive and nurturing portion of Plains society. It's a kind of equality of the genders that give certain kinds of power that are interdependent to each the activities of each gender. Men have to perform in ritual, in ceremony, to have the same kind of sacred or cosmological power. And this is from that Koba drawing sketchbook, and it shows the creation of the medicine lodge in Kiowa in Indian Territory. Pratt has nicely said this is a camp in the Wichita Mountains in Indian Territory for us. And it shows how they assemble the medicine lodge for the medicine dance. It's variously called different things in the different playing societies, but we're really talking about different instantiations of what's called the sun dance among the Crow or the Lakota or the Cheyenne or the Blackfeet. It's also called the medicine dance among Cheyenne and Kiowa. And it's something that happens generally in August. It brings the band together, and it's a 3-day ritual ceremony. There are many different parts of it, but one is a significant one is setting up the medicine lodge with the lodge pole and the different kinds of canopies or shadings and then the audience that's made up to witness what happens during the ceremony. And in this case, the ceremony is, and the sun dance or the medicine dance is really subjecting yourself to the higher powers, the other than human powers in the world, and asking for direction and for power in order to deal with the aspects of the life that you need to work with. And that could be against enemies. It could be about finding food. In this case, this medicine dance was so successful that the buffalo have actually materialized within the medicine lodge. Often the dance is meant to tell people who have made themselves piteous where they will find the buffalo herds. And so this seems to have worked in spades. Here's a Cheyenne version of it. And we nicely have written on the side for us that this is a Cheyenne medicine lodge. Howling Wolf, who is the Cheyenne artist here, said, and he was at Fort Marion, says the medicine men go on at certain times and fast for 4 days and go without food and water until the 5th day. They also are mortifying their flesh in order to make themselves piteous and to allow, to bring themselves into a place where the power can be conveyed to them from the other than human beings in the world. And the Lakota version shows this happening. This is the pledger who's making himself ready to basically attach himself to this pole by leather thongs that will be affixed to his, in his skin, in his chest. And through the process of the final day of the dance, he will pull himself free. Again, making your body and your mind open to receiving the direction of the other than human people. And that's a way of gaining power, which of course is what seems to be at issue in all of these ledger drawings. And then these sun dances are witnessed by, here we have the pledgers with their banners in one of the earlier days of the sun dance. And here we have the women and other men who are not direct participants witnessing. So we have all these different genres that are all speaking to the same thing, the way in which the ledger art actually conveys issues of status and issues of how one gains status through garnering power, both individually and communally, through ritual, through the activities of living and the meaning that is imbued by those activities. Ledger art also shows change. So we've already mentioned that the ledger art itself is showing the increased war hostilities and the exacerbation of the warrior activity and status within Plains society, which is accompanied by the elaboration of things that the warriors do, more warrior societies, more activity, more importance given to warring because of what's happening in terms of the settler colonial state and taking of Indian lands and the military clashes with the US forces during the period. So in some way, the ledger art just shows that change. But the ledger art also shows other parts of that process. So here we have one of the Fort Marion artists. I think this is Tsitsas, who's Cheyenne, also known as Coho, one of the Fort Marion folks, showing the prisoners that are being marched to the railhead where they were taken by train to Fort Marion. So this is on the way from Sill in Indian Territory in Kiowa land to the railhead that will take them across the continental US down into Florida. And so it shows the soldiers guarding them, the wagons that had the supplies, the horses that are now being let out to forage and drink, but also the guard of the prisoners as they're camped in front of the fires here. And so this is Coho or Titsas, a vision of it. Koba in that ledger book at UCSD also has his own similar scene, camping, where all the prisoners are surrounded by the guard as they stop for the evening. So you have, again, the ledger art actually showing the changes that are taking place in terms of the subordination of Plains peoples historically on the Plains as part of the story of incarcerating them in the reservations in the 1870s and 1880s, and then the life that they lead there. So this is probably by Koba, although we don't know for sure. I love the way he has this bird's eye view of a agency, one of the reservation agencies. So he's showing how life is being changed as people are placed on the agency, with the agency's corn and vegetable plot in front of it. This is either a school or another agency building. The way in which the villages did their outside cooking and camping, and then the roads that are built and the traffic that goes back and forth, walking between the buildings, horses going around. So again, showing that the life of the Plains people is changing as a result. And another one by Tsitsas or William Coho, showing on the reservations the day in which the annuities are distributed. These are the goods that are promised by treaty in exchange for the Indians giving up land and moving to the reservation. And it's showing that on annuity day, the way the material is carted from the agency buildings to the place of distribution, and then the agent and the important leaders supervising the distribution of goods. So here's some cloth that's being distributed as a part of this, and here breaking open some of the casks. So lots of kind of historical information, as well as the other kinds of bureaucratic changes in surveillance. So here, someone has helpfully said the government agent is coming to try and stop fighting between two Indian tribes. We have no idea whether that's accurate or not, but clearly the agent is off to doing some agency business right on the reservation here. another Lakota drawing. I think I have one more showing courtship in Southern Cheyenne in the early reservation period. And it shows also the change in dress that the reservation has brought. So these kinds of calicos are part of the annuities that people got because of the treaties and their relocating to the reservations. The parasol, obviously these are things that are added to the Cheyenne repertoire that are part of the process of subordinating the tribes to the reservations that have changed the way that courting is looks in this period. Okay, I'm going to move to the very last piece here, just to show what kind of cosmologically and in terms of the way this all fits into a Plains Indian worldview. When I say that, I'm lumping together in some sense Lakota and Blackfeet and Crow and Kiowa and Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, but the larger way in which power works and the larger way in which ritual works and the larger way in which the people and the relations with other than human powers work are similar across this large area of North America in the period that we're looking at. And I want to show how some of that happens. Earlier on, I showed you some pages from the same ledger book that showed the Sundance, right? It showed the audience, the various parts of the Sundance. But this is one that shows an animal. Essentially, it's an elk, a very powerful ungulate. And it has these weird kind of magpie. Magpies often are seen around buffalo and antelope because they like to pick at the insects that live on the ungulates. And you can see one right here. But then we have this hoop, and this hoop is actually a piece of material culture. It's actually a hoop. When people talk about the hoop of the nation in Plains Indian literature, they're talking about these hoops, which are ritual hoops that are part of the animal dreaming societies. And these animal dreamers meet along the same time as the Sundance. And the dreaming part of it is putting yourself into a space using a ritual that allows you to move from the corporeal world, from one world to another world, to get spiritual guidance, to get power. And this is showing in that transformation, the elk literally going from our world to the sort of other world. And it's facilitated by these things that are ritual markings of that state of transmotion between one world and the next. So these are the things that are signaling that that's in fact taking place. And you have and these are from very different books collected in different parts of the plains. So this is the ledger book that's Brûlé. This one's from Cheyenne River, another group of Lakota, but very similar ideas. So here we see these very powerful other than human beings that have the power to go from land to the air. And that process of going from land to the air is also a metaphor for prayer, for the supplication for knowledge and power that goes from people on the ground to the powers that are in the skies. And you can see, these are the stars. Sometimes this is also a kind of a storm recognition, and the sort of torment of the atmosphere as as the power of what's going on here courses through it. And you get these spirit lines that the protagonist, who is actually creating this ritual with the sacred pipe here, these power lines, spirit lines, are connecting these different bodies of knowledge and power in order to also transform the horse, which is a war pony of this person who's practicing here. And the horse is actually transmuting into a buffalo horse. So it's taking on the powers of the buffalo. The buffalo in Lakota cosmology are related peoples to the Lakota. They're another other than human power in the world. And so this is essentially a creation of otherworldly power that's manifesting itself before your eyes. And a version of this appears in that same other Black Hawk ledger as the now transformed practitioner who has the power. And on the other side of this page, it's written in a caption that he is himself as a destroyer. So he's taken on this power that has other than human powers of life and death. And you can see his horse has become eagle clawed and buffalo horned, and he has turned into this transformation of the power of the buffalo and the eagle as well. And they've become a unit. And this is kind of a rainbow. In other words, again, connecting that power of the heavens and the other than human powers to the earthly ones. So this is all in ledger art, right? Showing the way in which spiritual power is actually acquired and how it manifests itself. It's a spatialization of time. The time is transmuted into a kind of power which is made visible in these images. And you can see this in this very interesting set of pages from the Tie Creek Ledger, which is also a Cheyenne piece, probably Northern Cheyenne. And here you can see a similar transformation that's connected to heavenly bodies of the sun and the moon. And you get an idea of where this comes from Cheyenne cosmology, how it connects. I showed this earlier to show how we didn't have the sort of cultural capital and understandings to kind of locate what's going on here. But in fact, Cheyenne people would know some of this stuff, particularly if they were part of the power gathering process, like in a warrior society or priest or shaman of their own. This is a connection between ceremony, that transformation, and the power that's imbued in the universe. The Cheyenne are Algonquian speaking. They're connected to other Great Lakes and Eastern North American peoples, and they have this understanding of the reciprocal relationship between humans and animals that humans use to live, but partly through gathering that power in order to be able to live off of those animals. The eagles at the cardinal points are the guardians of what the Cheyenne call the nearer sky space. And this is a space where you communicate between the earth and the upper sky space, where the most powerful beings like Ma'eo, the All-Father, lives. And the persons here are being transformed through the ceremony with the spirit connections from that blue sky space to the below ground where the buffalo people live. They come from underground caves to be available for humans to use, to harvest, to hunt and slaughter. And the tracks show their emergence from the under earth, the caves, to the middle earth where they can be used by people. So this is showing a kind of map of the sources of power in Cheyenne cosmology in on this piece of ledger art. And in the same book, you had, you know, military exploits, you had hunting, and you had these ritual ceremonial power symbols as well. So you can see the power that's manifested is also the power that's behind, and this is from the same book, this page where this Cheyenne warrior in his magnificently appointed war shirt with the German silver hairpiece that's trailing down his back and has the taken a cavalry cutlass, which he's using to count coup on this soldier. So this really isn't about him beating the crow so much as showing the sources of that power that allow for the result to happen the way it happens. And that's what's really underlying Plains ledger art and the way it connects an understanding of a Lakota or a Cheyenne or a Kiowa worldview to what's being demonstrated on the pages. And I'll just use one last illustration back to that Koba book to show another kind of power that the Plains ledger art is showing. Now, let me remind you that compared to this, which is one of the earlier ledger books, which is part of that military exploit within the throes of the battles between the US military and the tribes on the plains in the 1870s. And this one, which is one of the artists, Koba, of the 72 captives that were sent to Fort Marion, who are now incarcerated into a military prison. But here he's showing himself, Wild Horse, which is the translation for Koba, and his wife on a horse in a procession with Turnip and his wife. Turnip is apparently a friend from the Kiowa that he knew because he doesn't show up in the Fort Marion. And Pratt has said, going to a neighboring camp on a visit at the bottom here. And the other page shows Medicine Man and his wife, and he is not Kiowa, but he's Cheyenne. Howling Wolf is one of the artists at Fort Marion and his wife. And here's the Howling Wolf glyph right here. So what is Koba showing us in this picture? In the middle of being incarcerated, 3-year stint in Fort Marion, Florida, he's showing us about the connection between the prisoner and his family, connections on the reservation, connections with his fellow prisoners and their folks on the reservation. So you can only read this as a establishment of the identity of the communities that these people come from, even while they're some 1,500 miles away from their families and their land, where some of them returned to after 1878. So there's another kind of power that's imbued even in the incarcerated images from Fort Marion. And I am just going to leave you with that. And also to remind you that many of the ledger books that I've drawn from and all of the ones that are at UCSD are at the plainsledgerart.org website. I've spent since the early 1990s coaxing individual owners, libraries, and museums to digitize their material. And sometimes I've done the digitizing and allow me to curate it together so you can get this body of work, which is scattered across the United States, into one location and use it and do research on it. And so this is lets you look at, right now there are over 40 different ledger books there. And I am going to stop, unshare my screen, and take any sorts of questions and discussions and I see one from the chat already that Judy asked, were these done with colored pencil and graphite? And the answer is almost always. Occasionally crayon is used, and even less often, but occasionally you have some sort of wash or watercolor. And these were available materials on the frontier, both from Army Depot, supply stores, and you could get them on the reservations as part of the annuities or the traders. They could be sometimes taken in raids. So these were things that were generally available by the 1760s to the Plains peoples. Did they use stencils to draw the horses? Yes, well, it does look like in some cases they took a kind of stencil and did a generic horse and then moved the horse or drew parts of the stencil in order to make the movement. On the other hand, it's really clear when you look at some of these drawings that much of this is freehand, and they were just extraordinarily good artists. But they did, because there were so many horses, they did seem to use some sort of form, some of them, to draw the horses. So if you look at the one I showed, let's see, let's go back there just for a second. Oh, I have to stop this in order to do that. Try this again. If you go back to the one I showed here, so you can see that this may be a kind of a stencil. They're very similar, but that they had to, some of them are larger and some of them are smaller, and they had to also reorient them in order to get the sense of movement and difference here. So yes, there's some help to make repetitive things, but as far as I can make out, only horses have ever been copied like that. You don't see other game or people or anything like that.
For questions, you can either raise your hand or you can unmute yourself. This is
yeah, there are not that many people. Just
yes,
unmute yourself.
Yes, just unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
I have a question. What would be? I understand that they were drawing in this one prison, but in the lives of the people, what was the meaning of the paintings? Why would they draw them? I mean, is that to show power, but with other things?
So it really is. It is a way of documenting power, because all of these images are communally, like all the exploits are communally verified, particularly the battles. So like you didn't just draw your own story and that gave you power. Often you weren't the artist even. Your story was done by someone in the band who was better at drawing than you were.
Oh.
And you would authorize them to do it. And then, but the process of telling the story and committing it to paper communally validated the value and effect of that power that you had demonstrated, right? You had manifested. So there's that. Yeah, there's a mnemonic way of understanding one's history, the narrative of those events, and those are meaningful not just because you got 4 horses, but because it increased the power or prestige or survivability of the band as a whole. And then also among the society of men, this was a way of documenting prestige and status within the society, within the band. So, and so we have some evidence that these things were shared among groups of men. Many of the ledger books are not just done by one artist. Some of them are done by a number of artists who clearly shared the book and put in different exploits and at different times. And so these things were handed around to remember the sources and manifestation of the events and power that allow those events to take place.
Any other questions?
I would just mention that there is a significant body of contemporary ledger artists. This ledger art was basically rejuvenated in the 1970s, and it was used as a way of re-narrativizing native understandings of history and the connection to the past that we've been looking at as a part of the political movement in the 1970s. It's often called the Red Power movement to gain a kind of sense of self-identity in the present within the United States. And it's used in a slightly different way because it's commenting on the past history in order to in order to draw a kind of resistive power in the present to both point at Native people as being present, as having voice, of being able to tell their own histories. And to some extent, it's actually using that earlier sense of power in order to insert oneself into the body politic of the present. And that's been continued now through 3 or 4 generations of contemporary ledger artists. Some extraordinarily interesting, accomplished, and sometimes quite humorous people poking fun at anti-Indianness of the present and ways of understanding the present with in relation to past Native histories. So it uses that the medium and the kind of pictorial language of ledger art, but casts it as a kind of resistive, anti-colonizing or decolonizing narrative or discussion of the present. That's another lecture. It's another part of this, but it's not dead. It's not gone. It's different. Let's see. Love the colorful patterns in the group drawings. Yeah, and the way in which color is used. They're constrained with the kinds of colors that you had in colored pencils in the 19th century, right? But they translate. For example, horses are translated so that you can actually tell when they're talking about a roan horse or a Appaloosa horse, even though the color they use may not have been the actual color because they just didn't have that color, but a kind of red instead of a brown or whatever. They just and then they use the sense of color to highlight the activity that's happening in interesting ways. Helen Hardin's art is an interesting comment. Reminds Claudia of ledger art, and in fact, Helen Hardin was part of a process of taking the artistic legacy of ledger art and repackaging it into a kind of studio style for contemporary, and this is now in the early 20th century, Native artists. So there is a connection with Helen Hardin, the Kiowa Five that were taught as in a kind of studio setting that are taking some ideas from ledger art and putting into early contemporary Indian art that was part of an art market, and this happens in the Santa Fe school as well, with the flat two-dimensional Pueblo art that's done. Helen Hardin is part of that. So there is a connection there, moderated often through non-native art teachers who are interested in developing a contemporary native artist sense of style. Yeah.
Any other questions? Do you want to mute yourself? You raise your hand. No? Okay. Professor Frank, thank you so much for being here with
You're
us.
welcome. I realized it was a little longer than you had bargained on, but I guess I got carried away.
It was very enjoyable indeed, and interesting to learn about these Indian ledgers. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for recording and let me know where it resides.
Absolutely, I will. Thank you, Professor Roth.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Very interesting.
Thanks.